Greetings and salutation, exiles. In this video, we're going to be going over a topic that I don't normally. The kind of content is much different than I normally cover. Usually, I cover the, Conan Exiles and wish list stuff, maybe gameplay stuff, or getting rated, or maybe some little bit of strategy or building guides. But this is more in the lore, kind of the universe that exists behind the game, kind of develop some perception, a little bit of substance to improve overall enjoyment of the content that we've dumped thousands of hours into. So Robert E. Howard is kind of the liter- uh, the writer behind the Conan universe, and he did a bunch of short stories about Crawl, and then later about Conan, and these all take place in a certain time in history, and he published this essay that worked out all the timeline, so everything that came before the Cataclysm, all these timelines that existed, and then everything after. And it's a pretty expansive essay. And in this essay, as I was reading through it, I could see parallels with our own history, and it really kind of blew my mind. And I started kind of reading between the lines, and I was like, okay, I think what he's done here is he's interpreted the way that he thinks history actually happened, and then basically what he's done is he's called it fiction, so that way he wouldn't be kind of laughed out or taken as a quack, or taken. So in this essay, he's basically portraying the Hyborian Age, a fictional setting of history story about Conan the Cimmerian. It was written in the 1930s, but not published during Howard's lifetime. It's just fascinating. So there's a few things there, like in this essay, in the first line, he says nothing in this article is actually considered as an attempt to advance any theory in opposition to accepted history. And I think that's wording is interesting. Accepted history. He's not saying factual history. He's not saying so. Even then, I get the impression that he's challenging history as it is in textbook. He's challenging the status quo, but he knows that he's not going to win that academic fight. Maybe he doesn't have the big universities behind him. Maybe he doesn't have, but the way that that's written, I kind of can read between the lines. And he's, because in this Wikipedia it talks about in his childhood he was obsessed with reading about history and the Egyptians and a lot of these ancient cultures. And I think at some point he formulated, kind of reverse engineered history, and used Conan as a fictional story to publish his version of history as he knew it at the time. So here I got a couple comparisons. I have Conan the Cimmerian versus real world history of Cimmerians. So now we now know in the last 15 years, um, we know that the Cimmerians, the real Cimmerians, the SUM spelling, is has was a global culture. They've pretty much been found. There's Cimmerian writing that has been found on every continent. It's in South America. It's in the Middle East. It's they've even found it in Antarctica. They've found some of this, and a lot of these temples are all kind of have have a relation to the Sumerians, and they had vast mining operations. They were a global empire, or a global civilization. They had the ability to sail, and so I think it's fascinating how he makes those references. Obviously, he's being coy about it and spells it different, so he's not challenged. Um, and then I've kind of bulletized some of this, or I've kind of broken these down in a question format to kind of entertain this idea that I have about um, this essay. and it's just it's all subjective, but he like Conan's like pre-catalysm versus real world flood. So we do know through carbon dating in the last 20 years or so, we do know that there was a worldwide flood about 13,000 years ago that was derived from a meteor strike. They don't really talk about that in the textbooks. That's something that really wasn't known 30 years ago or 35 years ago as you go through elementary school and you're getting taught, the evolution of the world. It's something that's relatively new in the scope of world history, and it's kind of contested to some aspect, but we it's generally everybody knows they got seashells on Mount Everest. Like it's kind of a known deal that there was a mass flood, and the Bible talks about it through the aspect of Noah. Noah's Ark. um, but with Howard's story, he refers to it as cataclysm, the cataclysm. And I think that's the parallels. We're talking about the meteor strike that happened in real world and the flood that took place 13,000 years ago, and in Howard's essay we're talking about the cataclysm. Okay? And Howard, his timeline and his essay is about 10,000 years, and that's parallel to, in the grand scheme of things, that's very similar to the real world flood or cataclysm that did take place, that knocked back civilization into the dark age. The So here we're going to go to the next slide. He also in his essay he talks about the Nibidan Chronicles, and I think this is a reference to Genesis. I think this is basically the Old Testament and Genesis. And as I read through this essay, and I've read through it a couple times, and some of these terminologies, I'm like, I've never seen this word before, so I Google them, and they're like ancient Celtic people or ancient Celtic races. And I'm like, oh wow, this is deep. And so I read paragraphs after paragraphs about these ancient cultures, and I'm like, that it's a little too convenient, the depth of knowledge that some of these terms that are being used in the way this, and it really kind of shows his intellect in history. It's super fascinating, and I mean, talk about going down the rabbit hole. And then try to comprehend some of this stuff. And so as I go through, I'm just kind of cutting and pasting these little excerpts out of this essay, and then I'll Google the kind of the real world experience, right? And so here he Howard talks about in his essay the pre-civilization that existed before the cataclysm, so the pre 10,000 years ago, and he names off these six pre-civilizations that all spoke the same tongue, all spoke the same language. And so I Googled pre-flood civilizations, and half of them are the same. And I was like, "Oh, that's fascinating." Obviously everybody knows about the Atlanteans from Greek mythology. The uh, Hyboria was the one that I found the most fascinating because that's derived from giants that existed in Greek mythology, an ancient giant race that existed in Greek mythology. And then I found it even more intriguing that he named his essay the Hyborian Age. I mean, almost the exact spelling. If you look at the comparison, it's like he just took out the PER. I was like, "Oh wow, that's kind of deep." And so um but those three races that I listed, there real pre-flood civilizations, they existed. We just don't have all the details, but we know they exist in human mythology as a real thing. um, Also, in Howard's essay, he talks about these cultures all speaking a common tongue, and immediately what came to mind is the Tower of Babylon. It's a pretty well-known story. I don't need to go into in depth, but it's basically pre-power Tower of Babylon. The world spoke the same language, and then uh, the king shot an arrow into the sky, and he basically uh, the Lord, punished the civilization, and everybody spoke a different language after that point, or the punish the race of man after that point. But it's fascinating that these themes are parallel throughout this essay, and as I read them, I'm able to in my consciousness, so oh, that sounds like the Tower of Babylon. Oh, that sounds like Atlantis. Like oh, that sounds like the meteor strike that flooded the world 13,000 years ago, and it's like wow. So, anyways, this content is much different than I traditionally do, but I'm digging in, kind of digging through the weeds, thinking real abstract, and I don't know if this is something that my general population, my subscriber base likes. There's no monetization in this, so it shouldn't be playing any commercials. Sometimes YouTube's a little tricky, and they try to do that kind of stuff on you. But as always, like and subscribe, and think critically, and let me know in the comment section how you feel about this type of content. There's a lot more I want to dig into it. I'm thinking about going through the demigods. I want to talk about the races that exist. So I want to do one on races and try to break down their kind of their characteristics, where they derive from. I noticed in the Hyborian age, a lot of races come from existing races. Like the Picts are actually descendants of Atlanteans, but have evolved backwards. And I found that super fascinating. And I'm also digging in to the ape men, because the ape men get beaten back by the Hyborians, and then they emerge like 1,000 years later as white-haired, upright men. And so I cannot figure out. I've been reading through lots of stuff trying to figure out what race that actually becomes. What their actual race is. Are they the sturgeons? I don't know. So I'm still trying to kind of. There's so much story there, and there's a couple other authors that have actually kind of filled in some context to some of these stories. Kind of close the loop on some of this stuff. But anyways, back to my original talking points. If you like these kind of deep dives on subjects, let me know what you think. If this is not the way I should go, let me know in the comments below. But as always, thank you for watching.